Welcome to today's National Ethnic Media News Briefing. I'm Sandy Close, Director of Ethnic Media Services and your moderator today. Today's briefing focuses on the debt ceiling crisis. Many experts believe that this was one of the most dangerous and maybe even futile standoffs on raising the debt ceiling that the U.S. government has engaged in. An agreement was struck, as we all know, between the White House and the Republican leadership, and Congress got the last word and confirmed the deal. The process and the results raise many questions. Is there a better way to do things? Will the resulting budget cuts and spending caps help or hurt the economy? Why are some adults, particularly poor and older adults, the losers in this scenario? And is this the end of the moratorium on college loan repayments? Is there any sign of a positive return to bipartisan deal-making despite deeply polarized politics? We have asked the experts on today's panel to discuss these issues and address your questions. Many of us know little about this topic. I'm a case study in someone who really badly needs an unpacking. So today is a welcome learning opportunity for us to share what we learn with our audiences. Our speakers today include Rachel Snyderman, Senior Associate Director, Business and Economic Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington. Shannon Buckingham, Senior Vice President for Communications and Senior Counselor at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Lindsay Owens, PhD, Executive Director for the Groundwork Collaborative. We begin with Rachel Snyderman, who will share her perspectives about the deal, whether it signals a return despite the polarization to bipartisan deal-making, and what her agency thinks can be done to reform the debt ceiling resolution process. Thank you, Ms. Snyderman, for joining us.
Thank you, Sandy, so much for having me. So first, I just want to start with a bit of context about what the Bipartisan Policy Center is. Since 2011, BPC, the Bipartisan Policy Center, has been a leading voice in providing objective analysis on the debt limit. And so we have worked each debt limit episode to provide that objective analysis as to what these costs look like, but to also estimate for lawmakers, give an independent look as to when that default date could be. And we kind of in our shop do the same thing, kind of crunch those numbers every single day, trying to estimate the millions of payments that are going in and out of the federal government on a daily basis. When the United States hit its statutory debt limit back in January, the Secretary Yellen immediately began deploying some administrative accounting procedures that are legally available to her so that we could operate under the debt limit for some time while lawmakers sort out their negotiations. And so it really was in the past few weeks where we saw both parties really enter that negotiating room with their list of priorities, and over the past few weeks kind of narrow down where those priorities overlapped. And so I think that the final bill, the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023, it reflects the hard work of compromise, that bipartisanship is not going to please everyone, but it will please the majority. I think at a high level, it's reflecting the gives and takes of some of the top priorities that we saw coming out of the Republicans, such as implementing caps on discretionary spending, but then also it is, in line with Democratic priorities, expanding access to some of those programs, and as well as making sure that we are not defaulting on our debt. And I think we can dive in a bit more to some of those other priorities that are in the bill that satisfy both parties. We also saw kind of reflected in the final vote counts that both sides of the aisle were able to bring their caucuses to the table. We saw, especially in the House of Representatives, more Democrats support this bill than Republicans. And we also saw that reflected in the final numbers in the Senate as well. And so I do think that while, we'll dive into the specifics of like where there are winners and losers, and that can obviously be a subjective exercise as well. I think that it does show that Washington is not necessarily broken, but that Washington also does love 11th hour deals. And so I think that, especially here at the Bipartisan Policy Center, while we applaud Congress's willingness to avoid default, I think it is important to note that this legislation leaves off some key areas that we want to see bipartisan reform happen. I think first and foremost that the bill only targets discretionary spending. We're not talking about some of the programs like Social Security, like Medicare, the largest cost drivers of our budget. Not necessarily saying we need to cut those programs, but we know that we need to reform them. We know that we need to strengthen them so that they remain solvent for the individuals who will rely on them in just the next decade. The bill also fails to look at new sources of revenue generation. We have to be serious about raising revenue through the tax code. We are now averaging annual $1 trillion deficits. And the bill really does nothing to look at the revenue side of the equation. And so I think that it is time that lawmakers come together to focus on solutions that can also raise revenues instead of just allowing taxes to be cut and to really only focus on a increasingly smaller share of the fiscal pie, which is this discretionary spending, which is really only about a quarter of the budget. To see the debt limit be kind of the hostage-taking device. It's the only time where both parties come together to have fruitful, meaningful discussions about fiscal policy. And I think a lot of that is reflecting the fact that the budget process needs reform, but also the fact that the debt limit really reflects that both parties are responsible for arriving at where we are in our fiscal, with our fiscal outlook. It's the result of tax cuts and spending increases that have been implemented by both parties over the past years. There's not one party to blame or one administration to blame. It's a collective effort based on the policies of the past that have been implemented. And so I do think that it does indicate that it's time to kind of rethink how we go about the debt limit and the budget process, because this current system is not working. The last time we were here was in the end of 2021, when the debt limit was raised not once, but twice. And again, in 11th hour deal making that held up the full faith and credit of the United States so that both parties could seek some sort of resolution. And so it's going to become the largest federal expenditure within the next 30 years. That is tremendous. And I think that as we think about these large numbers, what does a $31 trillion debt even mean? I think it's more important to kind of think about it in the context of what that spending crowds out. If our interest costs soon become our largest government program, what are we sacrificing in its absence? Are we not funding critical social programs that millions of American families rely on? Spending for defense and our military and foreign aid? investments in clean energy and education. So I think obviously, of course, the list goes on, but as our interest costs start to amount, it really is, and especially in a time of rising interest rates, it really is a signal to lawmakers that it's time to act now. And I think that, this legislation, while it's not perfect, it reflects, the bricks and the bones of priorities that both parties can agree on. It really should be a starting point for future discussions.
Thank you so much for your opening overview. Our next speaker is Shannon Buckingham of the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. Shannon, please share your thoughts with us.
Thanks so much, Sandy. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Shannon Buckingham. I'm Senior Vice President for Communications at the Center on Budget. We're a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit, nonpartisan policy research institute. We work on policy at both the federal and state level. So the center engaged deeply in the debate over the debt ceiling and the agreement that just passed, because the outcomes of those debates have such profound implications for people across the country, especially people who need support to make ends meet and who we want to ensure have the resources to thrive and to share in this country's prosperity. So let me just briefly start with the implications of default before I turn to the agreement itself, because I think it's important to take note of how high the stakes are in these debt ceiling standoffs. So first, we know that if an agreement wasn't reached and the nation defaulted, that would have had widespread negative effects on the economy as a whole and on people across the country. But we know those effects would have been felt deeply, very deeply by people who are the least economically secure. If default had extended on, we could have seen, millions of jobs lost, seen a spike in unemployment, and that often hits low-income communities and disproportionately hits Black and Latino communities very hard. So the stakes were really high here. And so let me turn to the agreement. So we saw the extreme nature of their demands in the bill that they passed a few weeks ago. Fortunately, the ultimate agreement that was reached avoided much of the damage that bill would have inflicted. So it's important to note that the deal is a significant improvement over that House bill. I think most concerning is a provision that will put SNAP food assistance at risk for very low income older adults through a bureaucratic work reporting requirement. So this policy is already in place for other adults in SNAP. It extends the age limit for that requirement to a group of people aged 50 to 54. And this policy will increase hunger and poverty among that group. This extended this requirement that folks between the ages of 50 and 54, one of the really difficult things about applying this requirement to people in this age group is that many of them are in poor health. Many low-income adults in this age range are in poor health. And as a result, they can't necessarily do the number of hours or perhaps the physically demanding jobs that they've had throughout their careers. And so many will lose the basic assistance that they count on to buy groceries because they can't meet this work reporting requirement. At the same time, under the agreement, veterans and people experiencing homelessness, along with children aging out of the foster system, can be exempted from these work reporting requirements now. So that was a positive provision that was gained during the negotiations that relies on states to be able to properly identify that folks meet that criteria. And that's a good policy, but I think we think it's important that we shouldn't have to trade off harming one group to help another. So the impact on the 50 to 54-year-olds is very concerning. And then I'll just talk about a couple of other concerns we have about the agreement. There are some problematic provisions related to the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, or TANF, which provides income support to some very low income families with children. And these are requirements that are just often really ill-suited to the needs of families who are being served by the program. It's really counterproductive that we're doubling down on these failed policies. These requirements really make it harder for them to meet the needs of very low income families. And we also know that the benefits these kids are getting when their parents get income support are just critical both to their long-term, short-term and long-term well-being. So where does that leave us? So first, as I think we've all agreed already, we've taken the threat of default off the table for an extended period. That's an important thing. But when I think about what's next, I think looking forward, we must really prevent further hurdles that keep people from getting the help that they need. We need to really put an end to this failed idea of work requirements. There's decades of evidence showing they don't work. We need to find a way to abolish the debt ceiling and end this absurd cycle of debt ceiling hostage taking. It distorts our democracy. It's not good for the country. It's not a good way for policymakers to come together to negotiate around really important decisions. We should be talking about policies that would broaden opportunity, reduce hardship that so many people in the country endure, and would really ensure that everyone has the resources to afford the basic, like food, a roof overhead, and healthcare. So that's the debate I think we feel we should be having. We really need to move away from this, cycle of debt ceiling. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you. So our third speaker is Lindsay Owens, Executive Director of Groundwork Collaborative. Thank you, Lindsay.
Yeah, thanks, Sandy. Thanks for having me. There are a number of ways to square this. You can raise the spending levels by larger amounts that will get you through a longer period of time. You can suspend the limit for a longer period of time, and you can eliminate the debt. We're really unique among nations in the political malfunction that surrounds the debt ceiling. And so I would just want to say, I don't think there's any virtue in this bipartisan deal coming together a week before the X date. There's nothing for either party to be boasting about. There's no sort of glory in the fact that it is bipartisan. We should not be in a position where the American government is getting to getting within a week of defaulting on its obligations. Remember, the debt ceiling isn't about future spending. It's about paying bills on spending that's already been incurred. So this lifting the debt ceiling has absolutely no bearing on fiscal matters moving forward. The reason that we're here today talking about the budget and talking about fiscal matters is actually mostly unrelated to the debt ceiling as a sort of structural matter, but rather because a contingent of Republicans in Congress insisted on tying a budget fight to the debt ceiling elimination, right? So the pairing of these two things is strictly artificial and strictly a political construction, not a requirement of lifting the debt ceiling. And so I think, there's really nothing for us to be proud of. We shouldn't be putting the American people in this position. Had a deal not come together, the consequences would have been extraordinary. I mean, Mark Zandi has estimated that between 7 and 8 million Americans would have lost their jobs had we defaulted on our debt for any period of time, and that up to $10 trillion in wealth would have been destroyed. So I think, we've lifted the debt ceiling in a bipartisan fashion without hostage taking and side deals dozens of times, and that would have been preferred here. Although I agree that there probably isn't the legislative support for passing a standalone piece of legislation to eliminate the debt ceiling, there are also administrative options, including we heard a lot over the last few months about the potential invocation of the Biden administration of the 14th Amendment. And so I think that's worth folks knowing about and looking into as well. But I'll talk just briefly about an important part of the deal, the IRS funding. So as part of this debt limit deal, to kind of really soften the blow of the cuts to the non-defense discretionary programs that I think Shannon laid out really well, the Biden administration agreed to Republican demands to shave off about $21.4 billion in funding for the Internal Revenue Service. And for those who haven't been following this issue super closely, last year when Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act, they allocated about $80 billion to the Internal Revenue Service over a 10-year window. And the goal of that funding was sort of to do a couple of things. One, to make sure that the IRS can hire the staff and build out the technological systems that are needed to really function effectively, to offer good levels of customer service, to help Americans file their taxes successfully. And, we're really already seeing the effects of that play out this past tax filing season. Call wait times were down about 85%, which is, just great for folks who don't have a lot of time to sit waiting on the phone with the IRS to figure out how to file their taxes and make sure they get the benefits that come through the tax code as well, things like the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit. That funding was also meant to enable the IRS to start better enforcing the laws on the books, to crack down on wealthy tax cheats and tax evaders. And we know that unfortunately, the top 1% of individual filers, the wealthiest 1% of individual filers, now make up about 70% of what we call the tax gap. That's the differences between taxes owed and taxes collected. And so that money was meant to provide the staffing and the capital and the resources to really start cracking down and auditing and enforcing the laws on the books so that the wealthy aren't, continuously cheating on their taxes. So, because that money would have resulted in better enforcement, actually the fact that we cut that $21.4 billion from IRS funding, we didn't save $21.4 billion. We actually lost $90 million because each dollar that is put forward for enforcement not only pays for itself, but actually brings in a little more than what's spent in revenue. And so I think it's really critical for folks to understand that despite the Republicans' top priority being budget cuts, this particular provision that they fought forcefully for actually results in a net increase to the deficit. And that's because it results in foregone revenue collection by the IRS. So that's just a really important piece of the deal that we haven't fully talked about. The other thing I'll say is, Shannon alluded to cuts to the non-defense discretionary budget, which is the sort of non-military spending side of the annual appropriations. And you may have heard in the press, you may have reported yourselves that there weren't cuts to the non-defense discretionary budget, that there was a freeze in the first fiscal year of the 2 fiscal year deal and a 1% increase in funds for the non-defense discretionary outlays in the second fiscal year of the 2-year deal. But Shannon is exactly right that actually the ultimate deal does result in cuts to non-defense discretionary spending. And one of the reasons why is because of inflation. So even though you freeze funding year over year, in a world in which inflation is 4 to 5%, inflation eats its share first, and then there are 5% less funds available to fund all of the programs that the NDD budget funds, whether that's 5% less housing assistance, 5% fewer slots for toddlers to go to Head Start, 5% fewer services for seniors. And so I think it's really important to understand that in a world in which we have rising inflation, which we're expected to have in fiscal year 2023 and fiscal year 2024 and 2025, a flat funding or 1% funding increase won't actually cover and the effects of inflation. And so I think that's another important piece here. So with that, I think I'll pause.
So what's your takeaway? What would you like to see the headline or the lead of our coverage be?
Well, one thing I think is great about this group of reporters is really focusing on the real life impact that these kinds of decisions have on people, on real people. And so I think the thing I'd love for folks to take away is not the sort of gamesmanship and the politics and the sort of who won and who lost in Washington, but what are the real implications for people across the country and their day-to-day lives? And I feel like that's important way to judge this agreement.
Terrific. Rachel, what would you want to see us take away?
I agree. I mean, I think that it's so many of the question, and I think Seema, you brought this up so eloquently in your points, is that this all comes back down to the voter, right? And that all politics is local. And I think that we can so easily get lost in this debate of these macro elements, but we have to really remember that it's who we send to Washington to represent our core values, and that, you know, they have a job to do to reflect those values from back home. So I think it's all about making it local and personal, which is what you all are doing in your work.
Thank you. And Lindsay, you get the final shout out for us.
Yeah, I would just say it's important not to forget to cover, you know, a critical piece of the story, which is that, you know, not a single dollar was raised from the wealthier corporations in this debt ceiling deal. And all of the downside in this deal, all of the spending cuts this deal did usher in to sort of ostensibly reduce the deficit, you know, were the results of, you know, punitive measures affecting the most vulnerable communities, you know, kicking 50-year-olds off nutrition assistance. And I think, you know, the U.S. has got to reconcile, you know, the politics of taxing wealthy corporations, or we're going to keep, you know, kicking older Americans in the teeth every 2 years when we deal with one of these debt ceiling deals.
I can't thank you three enough for taking time out. You've been great speakers, and we're happy to bring our sector together with your expertise. Thank you so much.